of multiple moral theories. As a result, we have normative theories to tell us how one ought to act. But the real question of ethics is, what motivates people to behave or to act morally? What is the nature and the source of moral motivation? Philosophers such as Immanuel Kant have argued that the fundamental characteristic of normative judgments is their strength to motivate right action. The crucial question is, can contemporary virtue ethics be normative? And if so, can Zagzebski's recent theory of exemplarism help solve the crucial question in all normative ethics, that is motivation? Linda Zagzebski outlines a radical kind of motivation-based virtue theory called exemplarist moral theory, or simply exemplarism. She shows how a moral theory based on exemplars can serve as a viable alternative to existing moral theories. The aim of this research is to undertake a critical inquiry into Zagzebski's exemplarist moral theory and its claim of moral normativity encompassing specific cross-cultural implications. Status questionis and originality of the research. Across the annals of history, it has been evident that every culture, tradition, and civilization recognizes certain individuals who are morally exceptional as role models or examples to follow. Within the realm of moral philosophy and ethical discourse, the term virtuous has long been associated with individuals who exemplify the highest standards of moral character and conduct, who serve as a moral exemplars. Linda Zagzebski's exemplarist moral theory is a moral theory in which moral exemplars play a foundational role. The central concept of a theory is that a moral theory can be established by direct reference to exemplars who embody moral goodness. She claims that we identify moral exemplars directly through the emotion of admiration. The primary questions that Zagzebski's exemplarism provokes are: can a normative moral theory be founded on emotion? How does Zagzebski intend to defend such a position? Can individuals be distinguished as genuine moral exemplars based on an emotion of admiration? Even if admiration aids in correctly identifying them, does it do so for the right normative reasons? And what are the essential prerequisites for an individual to be recognized as a moral exemplar? Zagzebski's moral theory aims to be both theoretical and practical, motivating people to be moral by showcasing exemplars. My research evaluates if her theory effectively encourages people not only to act morally, but also to do so for the right reasons, while offering practical guidelines for ethical living. The objective of my research is to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of Zagzebski's exemplarism to determine if it qualifies as a normative ethical theory. Zagzebski's exemplarism aims to provide a philosophical framework adaptable to different communities and to facilitate cross-cultural discourse by exploring admirable figures from different cultures. In order to test a claim, I have contextualized my research in the pluralistic and multicultural context of India. In this endeavor, on the one hand, in support of Zagzebski, I have identified and picked out certain moral exemplars from the pluralistic context of India and explored the possibility of using them as worthy role models to be imitated or emulated. Furthermore, to demonstrate how Zagzebski's theory significantly impacts moral normativity in practice, I have highlighted the serious problems and challenges that arise with extreme admiration of so-called moral exemplars, which has fostered a culture of hero worship, personality cults, and deification of self-proclaimed gurus and fraudulent godmen, all of which have cast a decidedly detrimental shadow over contemporary Indian society. I believe this dissertation makes a contribution to the current research in the field of moral exemplars. Although research and studies on the role of moral exemplars in moral education, psychology, and theology are ongoing, my contribution to the research is specific in terms of its normative and critical assessment, as well as its contextual and cross-cultural implications. Through my research, I have tried to test the hypothesis of whether exemplarism as a moral theory is capable of morally educating people by providing different versions for different communities that have different needs. For the methodology employed in this dissertation involves a historical, critical, and contextual study of Zagzebski's exemplarist moral theory in relation to virtue ethics with implications for cross-cultural contexts. The research has a historical dimension as it traces the origins of exemplarism to the development of virtue ethics. It adopts a constructive and textual study approach in terms of its exposition of Zagzebski's exemplarism in and through the principal text of the author. The research is highly critical of the theory in question, particularly in regard to its claim of normativity and the identification of authentic moral exemplars. Additionally, the research is contextual as it has practical implications within a concrete and relevant setting, namely India's multicultural environment. The structure of the thesis and the main argument. The structure of the thesis is divided into 4 chapters with an introduction and a conclusion. The first chapter provides a selective historical enquiry into the tradition of virtue ethics with respect to the virtuous agents as exemplars and situating Zagzebski among the revivalists within this tradition. While the term exemplar may not have been explicitly used in the ancient texts, the underlying idea of virtuous individuals serving as models or examples of moral excellence is central to virtue ethics. The chapter explicates that an exemplar of virtue is a virtuous person, and the term exemplar is closely linked with the concept of virtue. In ancient virtue ethics, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle emphasized the importance of virtuous individuals or moral exemplars who embody the virtues and serve as models for others to emulate. Aristotelian virtue ethics, though did not explicitly speak of exemplars as such, did focus attention on the role of phronimos, that is the person of practical wisdom, as the exemplar of virtue. The Aristotelian phronimos, the person who is skilled in the exercise of virtue, serves as a moral exemplar for the student of virtue. Hence, ancient virtue ethicists emphasized the role of exemplars as a means of moral education and personal transformation. The second part of the chapter discusses the revival of virtue ethics in contemporary moral philosophy, with specific references to Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Alastair McIntyre, Rosalind Huxhouse, Christine Swanton, and Michael Slot. The concept of exemplarity, which involves admiring and emulating individuals with exceptional qualities, was largely ignored in modern moral philosophy, but has been revived with the resurgence of virtue ethics in the later half of the 20th century. The chapter connects the revival of virtue ethics with the exemplarist tradition and presents the virtuous moral agent and the moral exemplar established in virtue ethics as a normative approach alongside deontological and consequentialist approaches. The second chapter is a descriptive and constructive exposition of Zagzebski's exemplarism in terms of its individuality, uniqueness, and theoretical structure. What sets exemplarism apart from other theories is its central claim that exemplars of moral goodness are the foundation of ethics. All moral terms such as virtue, right act, duty, and good life ought to be defined with reference to the exemplars that we admire upon reflection. Zagzebski suggests that admiration is the key to recognizing exemplars and being motivated to emulate them. She recognizes exemplars as heroes, saints, and sages. Heroes exemplified by individuals like Leopold Sosha, who rescued people during the Holocaust, embody the virtue of courage. Saints represented by people like Jean Monnier, who work with large communities, embody the virtue of charity. Sages such as Confucius exemplify wisdom. Zagzebski argues that moral terms can be defined with reference to the exemplars that we admire, with virtue being defined as a trait we admire in an exemplar. It is what makes persons like that admirable in a certain respect, and so on. She suggests that moral exemplars can play a significant role in encouraging moral development. By admiring these exemplars, we begin to envision ourselves becoming like them. As we continue to imagine ourselves embodying virtuous characteristics, we gradually develop these traits within ourselves. Zagzebski also delves into the practical aspect of moral development, suggesting that imitation and emulation are essential to moral education because they provide the initial motivation to become virtuous and aid in the development of virtuous motives. She defines key value terms by direct reference to exemplars, positing that the notion of what is desirable should be determined by what is admirable. She also defines the deontic terms by direct reference to exemplars, whereby they are defined by the exemplars' judgments rather than by their acts or psychological features. She examines the definitions of right and wrong acts, defining a wrong act as an act that is blamed by persons of practical wisdom, and defines a right act for a given individual in particular circumstances as what the person with phronesis would characteristically take to be the most favored by the balance of reasons for that individual in those specific circumstances. Finally, Zagzebski discusses the theories of direct reference and externalist semantics which have influenced her approach and thereby recommends exemplarism as a unique theory that allows for a number of variations. The third chapter is a normative and critical enquiry into Zagzebski's exemplarism. Some of the critical questions addressed in this chapter are whether exemplarism efficiently motivates people to perform a morally good action and provides helpful guidelines on how to live and solve ethical problems. Why does Zagzebski rely solely or at least primarily on the emotion of admiration? Can a psychological emotion of admiration be granted a privileged epistemic position in a moral theory? And since exemplarism is presented as an alternative to existing moral theories, can it be acknowledged as a normative ethical theory? Zagzebski believes that the central ethical concepts can be understood by observing and following specific exemplars. However, identifying and picking out moral exemplars presupposes some prior knowledge and understanding of what is good and what virtues are, and even requires certain moral attitudes, dispositions, and moral traits, which creates circularity in her theory. Zagzebski argues that emotions are connected to cognitive perception and cannot be separated from it, and that admiration is a trustworthy emotion that we can trust after conscientious reflection. However, it is important to note that admiration alone does not suffice to determine the morality of a person admired, as history has demonstrated that individuals such as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin garnered widespread admiration despite their engagement in heinous and morally reprehensible deeds. In addition, their capacity to admire requires certain character traits and practical wisdom to accurately assess who deserves admiration and emulation. Zagzebski's emphasis on admiration neglects the role of other moral emotions and fails to address how admiration distinguishes itself from other emotions. Admiration can lead to moral blindness, causing individuals to admire the wrong person, raising questions about the reliability and trustworthiness of moral judgments based on admiration. Although Zagzebski's proposed critical reflection is important for avoiding mistakes, the fact that admiration in itself seems capable of making such critical reflection difficult leads us to doubt whether admiration will always play a positive epistemic role. Zagzebski's theory of moral development underscores the significance of exemplars in tracking values, particularly the disposition to admiration and emotion dispositions of individual virtues. Nevertheless, choosing morally exceptional individuals like heroes and saints as exemplars can lead to the feasibility problem, leaving people frustrated if they cannot realistically replicate the exemplar's actions. The non-motivating admiration problem is another issue, where exemplars may lose their power to motivate if people realize that strict emulation of the exemplar is beyond their reach. Furthermore, using heroes and saints as exemplars can distort an ordinary person's perception of their duties and obligations. In general, while exemplarism may be useful for dealing with some practical issues, it may prove inadequate for resolving complex ethical dilemmas that emerge with applied ethics, such as those pertaining to bioethics, social or political ethics. The last chapter explores the cross-cultural implications of Zagzebski's exemplarism in the pluralistic context of India, highlighting both its benefits and drawbacks. In support of a cross-cultural approach to the concept of the hero, the saint and the sage in India's multicultural context, the chapter identifies Hero Sharmila as a hero embodying courage, Thomas Raja as a saint embodying charity, and sage Thiruvalluvar as the embodiment of wisdom. The second part of the chapter focuses on the cross-cultural disagreements over Zagzebski's exemplarism in the social, political, and religious context of India. By underlining the fundamental flaw of granting the emotion of admiration a privileged epistemic position in a theory, the chapter demonstrates how it greatly impacts the theory's moral normativity in practice. Using biographical narratives and empirical data, it highlights the problems and challenges associated with extreme admiration of so-called exemplars, which has given rise to the phenomenon of hero worship or cult of personality and idolization of self-proclaimed gurus and fraudulent godmen in the contemporary Indian society. Limitations of the research. Linda Zagzebski's research encompasses a broad range of topics, including virtue ethics, virtue epistemology, philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, and the metaphysics of fatalism. In my dissertation, though I have made references to other works, I have limited myself to her ethics, especially to exemplarist model theory, and to a certain extent her divine motivation theory. Though her ethics is grounded in the long tradition of virtue ethics, exemplarism is a relatively recent theory, and the complete work by the author, Exemplarist Moral Theory, was published and made available only in 2017. As a result, there remains a lack of resources and materials regarding the theory's interpretation, understanding, and critical analysis. The foremost challenge in my research lay in the fact that Zagzebski's exemplarism is a recent theory and is still evolving. Investigations, comments, remarks, criticisms, analysis, interpretations of the theory and its applications are still ongoing, and my dissertation also falls in part of that ongoing process. given that the philosopher on the study is currently alive and her thoughts and opinions may evolve, my dissertation also remains open to correction, change, and modification in the future. Conclusion. Linda Zagzebski's exemplarist moral theory is a remarkable contribution to contemporary moral philosophy, offering an innovative and positive approach to ethics by focusing on the emotional and cognitive dimensions of morality. It integrates emotions, particularly admiration, as significant factors in moral reasoning and development. This unique approach challenges traditional rationalistic ethical theories, offering a compelling alternative that underscores the importance of virtues and moral motivation. It encourages individuals to aspire to live morally virtuous lives, guided by the examples of those who have excelled in their moral character. However, critical analysis has uncovered certain limitations and challenges. The potential over-reliance on emotional responses, the questionable foundation of admiration, subjectivity in identifying exemplars, lack of concrete guidelines for moral action, and potential idolization of exemplars present valid concerns. Moreover, the theory's applicability in diverse cultural and socio-political contexts, especially evident in the Indian context, raises questions about its effectiveness in addressing complex moral challenges. Finally, while Zagzebski positions exemplarism as a normative ethical theory, critical evaluation reveals concerns regarding its normative power, especially in providing clear universal moral principles. The variability in the selection of exemplars and potential conflicts between different exemplars further challenge its normative force, prompting a re-evaluation of its efficacy as a comprehensive ethical theory. In essence, while Zagzebski's exemplarism offers a valuable framework that integrates diverse ethical perspectives and underscores the role of practical reason, practical wisdom, its status as a normative ethical theory remains debatable, and further refinement is needed to address the identified limitations and criticisms. However, it is important to note that these criticisms and challenges do not necessarily invalidate exemplarism entirely, but they highlight areas where further refinement and development may be needed. Different perspectives and ongoing critical inquiry can help address these concerns within the framework of the theory. As it currently stands, Zagzebski's exemplarist moral theory, or exemplarism, does not qualify as a fully fledged ethical theory. Nevertheless, it could be regarded as another version of virtue ethics, or a supplement to already existing theories, providing an additional contribution to the process of moral education rather than seeking to replace them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're working today in the area of epistemology, metaphysics, philosophical theology, and ethics. So if I criticize her, I do so with the utmost respect. And I would say the same for Stephen. He's one of the most distinguished candidates we have, and so if I criticize you, I do so with the utmost respect for your work. The dissertation is very impressive. It covers a very complicated theory, and it tries to draw a certain coherence out of it in order to criticize it, and criticize it fairly, I must say. In her recent work, in ethical theory, Professor Zagzebski has attempted to resolve a conflict at the heart of modern normative ethical theory, namely the tension between obligation and duty, namely morality as a set of binding commands, and the natural desire to live a happy, fulfilled life. This project seemed to be at the root of her 2004 book, divine motivation theory, which I want to come back to because it's an interesting tension with her later work, I think, in which she developed a motivation-based virtue ethics upon theological foundations. This type of motivation provided by God was intended to restore classical concepts of virtue ethics. In other words, Aristotle's phronimos, whose goal was not to attain material success, but eudaimonia, flourishing as a species being. But today these views might seem to be confounded by the deep subjectivism about what flourishing can mean for culturally diverse worlds of value reduced to preference utilitarianism. My impression of her current work on ethics is that there's a lot of juggling going on, and therefore the attempt to make sense out of it is very, very difficult and very challenging. Let me just say a word about the achievement of your dissertation before I get to some of the questions. Stephen's well-conceived dissertation recognizes the challenge to examine such a complex ethical theory within philosophical normative tradition from Socrates to Hume, Kant, Anscombe, and finally to Zagzebski herself. The complete work is evidence of exhaustive research and careful interpretation, especially the whole context and the background of ethical normative theory. Stephen provides sufficient historical context to virtue theory to begin his main task, which is a critical account of exemplarism. Exemplarism is the theory that ethical models exist as concrete instances of virtue in every culture and can be described as such and imitated because they evoke our immediate admiration. But the innovative aspect of her theory is not the mundane fact that we all tend to imitate models of excellence in our various pursuits, but rather an account of how we come to recognize models of excellence by our response of admiration. So I think this is really perhaps the key hinge in her theory, is the recognition of this. And if she's a little bit, I don't want to say sloppy, because she's not a sloppy thinker, but if she's a little bit negligent in making this connection very, very tight, the way that Kant does, and the way that Aristotle does too, without having any commands at all, without having any abstract normative commands in Aristotle's theory, except for three things. Famously, murder, theft, and adultery. Those are the only things you can't do for Aristotle. Everything else has to be applied without fruition of the concrete case. But I think that's where that hinge factor of how do we recognize. So I don't think motivation, which you emphasize and she emphasizes, I don't think motivation for me is something really important. It's really recognition of how do we come to recognize the phronimos in our lives, especially with so many claims to be exemplary characters in our world. So I think this is a real problem. It's really an epistemological problem, which is really one of her fields of expertise. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of a serious deficiency of effect in your theory. How does admiration for the lives of excellent human beings, and we know that the Greek term for virtue, arete, just means, in the ethical context, excellence of character, and modes of choice and involved choice. So I think this, I find that her theory about the way the phronimos chooses an act on the basis of the end, where Aristotle says the end is the beginning. The end, of course, is the telos, the good, and that's the beginning of the act. I think that's one aspect of her theory that could be, I think, tightened up a bit in the future. And this is determined by a person of practical wisdom. So this, Aristotle in Book 2 of the Ethics, Chapter 6, makes a lot of this. That it's the person of practical wisdom who has this as the main manifestation of his wisdom, of his virtue, of his capacity to choose the good in every single context. Now, I think that one of the problems that we have to get to that, and you should examine, is the thought, and this will come up later in the questions, is how do we see the act of deliberation, the act of choosing within the phronimos? I'm sure she would say something like, well, you see the choosing in the manifest act of choice. You see that when the person chooses. But what we're really interested in, I think, with Aristotle, is the deliberation that's going on before you see the explicit choice. And I don't think we see deliberation. How do we see thought? How do we see thinking? To admire thinking. We don't admire, it's difficult to admire thinking, to admire thought, to admire deliberation, because it's not visible. I mean, this is the kind of criticism that I would make of using Putnam's theory in this context, which I think is a very good theory in epistemology, but I'm not sure it works in the realm of ethics, at least the way she wants it to work in ethics. There are therefore, several serious obstacles here in her theory. Recognizing who is the person of excellent moral character, who is the phronimos, allowing this recognition to produce admiration, and finally the emotion of admiration bringing about the same types of virtues, when most of that is hidden. It is not really visible to perception. The way water is visible to perception. We can look at it, we can taste it, we can feel it, etc. Each stage of exemplarism seems fraught with serious difficulties. So I'll skip some of them for a moment. My hesitation is that she describes this theory as a definition of the phronimos. Perhaps it is a definition in some loose sense, in an ostensive definition, but clearly, when we're talking about water as H2O, is an accurate a posteriori definition of water. But Zagzebski wants to replace this sort of conceptual judgment with the direct reference of the perception of the empirical liquid that we all recognize, even if we don't know the scientific formula. Now, isn't the ethical judgment, phi is good, wherever phi is good, equivalent to water is H2O. Not that something is water, but water is H2O. In other words, when we make an ethical judgment, phi is good, we're making a judgment based on H2O. Water is H2O. We want to know exactly what it is. H2O directly picks out something and places restraints, these are normative restraints, on what we pick out. Whether we're on Earth or on Mars, or the recent Indian landing on the moon. We don't want to just look at the appearance of water, we want to make sure that the water is what we're looking for, that the liquid on Mars or the liquid on the moon is H2O. Let me begin to ask some questions now, specifically to you. So, there's a question here of, as I already mentioned, replacing divine command theory, which she's already done in her first work in 2004, divine motivation. So instead of divine command, you have divine motivation. With the motivation theory, that would seem to avoid the ontological tension between God's motivation as the good and our motivations. But doesn't this leave the ethical obligation lacking both a divine command structure and the human motivation, subject to the contingent desires of the will? That is, without some normative basis, either in divine command or divine being, or in human motivation, it leaves it open to the contingency of desire and will. What Zagzebski wants to discover is a viable response to our underlying question: can a description of an action give us clear confidence about its moral value? So my question is, has she tried to replace divine motivation theory with an emotional motivation? And how can she avoid this troublesome conclusion?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
So it's really a question about how to relate. I remember asking you this question maybe a year ago, maybe more than a year ago, thinking that her only work on divine motivation theory was 2004, but then you reminded me, because I didn't know at the time, that she had written an article in 2016 on this, right in the middle of her work on exemplaric theory. So that's the question. Is she making a hole in her theory, but why does she go back to the motivation theory so late in the day?
Actually, the seed of exemplarist moral theory could be found in the divine motivation theory. So the main argument of divine motivation theory was that all values flow from God. That was the main argument of her divine motivation theory, where she presents Jesus as the exemplar par excellence, like God as the exemplar par excellence. And that theory, it was highly metaphysical, and there was many criticisms regarding that theory, because how could God be an exemplar for a human being to imitate him? So she had dealt with a lot with incarnation. It was the central part of the whole theory. She speaks about incarnation and all. But the central thing is that point of motivation. Now, what motivates a person to behave or to act morally? So the point of motivation. So the real seed of the divine motivation theory was found in the divine motivation theory. And since from that theory onwards, she found that was more of a Christian theory. And in order to make a more moral theory which could be accepted by everybody, she started writing this divine motivator, this exemplarist moral theory, giving emphasis to this point of emotion-based and motivation-based theory, and taking exemplars from our everyday circumstances or everyday lives. And that's why she brings in this moral exemplars. And this moral exemplars she categorizes into three categories. That is the heroes, the saints, and the sages. So that could be also more categories. She only restricts to this. And so she brings in these moral exemplars as the foundation of a moral theory.
Okay, well, why did she go back in 2016 to the previous theory?
No, she did not go back to her previous theories. She wrote a paper on, before this exemplarist moral theory. She named her theory as exemplarist virtue theory. So it was only a kind of a preliminary draft before she could make this fully fledged theory. So it was more of a version of virtue ethics rather than an independent theory. So she calls this present exemplarist moral theory as sui generis, or it could stand by itself, or it is a fully fledged moral theory. So from that article to this, if you see that like she slowly goes away being a part of virtue ethics, to becoming a fully fledged ethical theory, which does not fit into any other categories, either deontological or utilitarianism or virtue ethics, but it is something different. She doesn't say that it is
But the title of the 2016 article is Divine Motivation Theory and Exemplarism. That's the title.
Yeah, that article, okay, that article, that article, she only makes a comparison, and whereby she is trying to show the shift she has been taking from there to here. But most of the definitions which she speaks about, mostly with regard to the moral terms, like for example, virtue, duty, good motives, good life, right act, wrong act. These are definitions already which she had already given in the divine motivation theory. But there is a little difference, because the time she herself says that the time when she wrote the divine motivation theory and the time now she wrote the exemplar moral theory, there has been a lot of evolution from that period. Like she was more in tune with the definitions of Rosalind Hart's house, where Rosalind Hart's house gives more importance to the phronimos. So good act is the act that is done by the phronimos with practical wisdom. A man with a practical wisdom. Okay. So she goes very much with that.
But I just stop you, so I have more questions to ask. Thanks very much. That helps me a little bit. Let me move to